Welcome to Service Titans, the podcast where we dive deep into the inspiring journeys of Black men within the AmeriCorps community. From serving in classrooms to rebuilding neighborhoods, these are the stories of passion, purpose, and resilience. Join us as we amplify the voices of members of the AmeriCorps community and share their triumphs, challenges, and the impact they've made in their communities. Whether you're a seasoned AmeriCorps veteran or someone considering service, this is the space to explore, reflect, and be inspired. Get ready to be uplifted, empowered, and connected. This is Service Titans.
The views and opinions shared on this podcast are those of the individuals speaking and do not reflect the views of their employers, organizations, or any groups they may be affiliated with. We are here to have real, honest conversations, and that means everything shared is coming from personal perspectives, not on behalf of any company or institution. Some episodes may include discussions around sensitive topics that could be triggering or emotionally intense for some listeners. Please take care of yourself and pause if you need to.
What up, Bill? This is Service Titans, the show where we discuss the stories, experiences, and insights of remarkable individuals who are making a difference in their communities and beyond. I'm your host, Anton Taylor. Today's guest is a powerhouse in both education and the arts, a hip-hop educator, artist, and cultural leader who bridges music, social impact, and community engagement. With 6 transformative years of service to AmeriCorps, they've used hip-hop not just as a genre, but as a tool for leadership, building, and learning across classrooms, stages, and communities. They've released over a decade's worth of thought-provoking music, including a highly anticipated hip-hop leadership course dropping soon, and have collaborated with artists across the country on projects, from keynote talks at Harvard and Boston College to workshops at high schools and juvenile halls. Their curriculum and performances challenge systems, uplift voices, and reimagine what's possible through hip-hop. Join me in welcoming my guy, Paul Willis, to Service Titans. Welcome, Paul. Glad to have you on.
Hey, what's up, Anton? It's really good to be here. This is an amazing opportunity to share some stories.
That's awesome, man. So, I want to get right to it. And I think part of that is just starting with the why. So when we think about just our journey, I think why is so important to you, that and what motivates us. But in this particular instance, I think AmeriCorps is such a critical part of this podcast. And I would love to start with your why. Like, what originally inspired you to say yes to a year of service with AmeriCorps?
Yeah, I think the biggest reason why is because people were there for me, whether it was, my second grade teacher who showed up for me when I broke my leg every day after school to give me the lesson and make sure that I didn't fall behind. My advisors in middle school who, really saw my potential and helped me fill out applications for private day and boarding schools throughout New England. It would take me on school visits, right? The college application process, very, very similar thing, having people support me in essay writing, mentorship, advising, and even transportation. There were people who did things for me, growing up. My grandmother, one of the biggest, she stepped in, to raise me and my brothers and sisters. My mom was, addicted to drugs and alcohol. It was the 80s, so it was a tough time for a lot of, Black people, especially in the inner city during that time. So my grandmother, stepped up and said yes and raised us, right? And so, there are people who've done things for me that I can't ever repay back, so I've decided to just pay forward. And through AmeriCorps, it was really my first opportunity to re-engage with my community, to start to pay it forward, looking at the next generation and saying, I want to provide for y'all what other people help to provide for me.
Yeah, man, that's so dope, Paul, because, it's the old African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child. And I think you just shared your village and the multitude of people who played a small and big role into your why and why you're so committed to the work that you do today. So Paul, if you kind of think about and look back to that first year of AmeriCorps service, what would you say, what kind of leader were you stepping into that space? And kind of fast forwarding in some way, how have you changed over time, and what role did AmeriCorps maybe play in it?
Yeah. I think back on that first year, and I was a mess, you know, coming into that year, I was homeless. I had a little bit of money saved up because I worked at a summer camp, but my life felt like, I didn't have any stability, right? And so, for me, I knew I wasn't ever going to sell drugs or join a gang or any of those kinds of things, right? I saw what drugs did to my mom. I saw what gangs were doing in my community, and I was like, I don't want any parts of that. And so City Year kind of represented for me an opportunity to do well and do good, and I remember showing up at just basic training academy, and there were all these rules, and your socks had to be black and white, and you gotta wear this uniform, and days full of training. And for me, I was like, I love this because the alternative is, you know what I mean, the streets. And so yeah, like, y'all want me to show up here on time? Sure, whatever you tell me to do, I'm going to do. I didn't necessarily know then what kind of leader I was. I might have been even more, a little bit of a follower at that time, but I knew that I had a purpose, and I knew that that purpose was tied to, making kind of responsible, positive decisions, things that would help, turn my life around and, push me into a position where I could continue to be somewhat positive, in my family and in my community. And that was important to me. And so I think, my placement really had a big impact on my leadership development. I got placed at my elementary school, and when I showed up, with my team and everybody, my principal was still there. 20 something years later, she was still there. Some of the teachers remembered me and my brothers and sisters. So it's a really special thing to return to the James W. Hennigan, elementary school, and then to serve students who were the younger, like, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins of people I grew up with in the community. And so it was a really special thing, but it taught me a lot about how integrity matters, right? So if I'm showing up and I'm telling kids to do something, I've been in their shoes before, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that I automatically have their respect, right? And so in order to earn that respect and to gain their trust, right, consistency was important. Showing up with a positive attitude every single day was important, even though it felt like, again, I don't have my life figured out, but these kids don't know that, right? And for them, they're trying to figure out their stuff too. And so, showing up for them as a servant leader and just really kind of, walking the talk, right? So my students that year were going through some really difficult things, right? Loss of family members, things happening in the community, just a ton of uncertainty in their lives. And so, I realized, how traumatic that can be. And I really thank, City Year and a lot of the training around trauma, around, the brain body connection, and just starting to have language around that, because I didn't have language around, any of that mental health, what people need to feel supported, stages of youth development. I had none of that prior to going into, City Year. And so taking the time to, do that work with my students to help them understand that their body's having, physiological reactions to the stuff that they're experiencing, to the stuff that they're seeing and hearing. When I'm telling them about healing, right, and how to develop methods to cope, I'm also realizing that I need the same exact things too, right? And so I can't tell them, hey, you should take a moment to breathe if I'm also not taking that same moment to breathe too, right? And moving from that place of surviving to then self-actualization is a really long road. And so for me, just starting at that place of understanding what, my basic needs were, addressing those, right? I was able to kind of roommate with, another city year member from a different school site. I moved into was like a city year frat house, with like 13, city year people, in the same 3-story home in Roxbury, which is a neighborhood in Boston, predominantly Black neighborhood in Boston. And so, kind of being around people who were driven and connected with a lot of the same purpose was helpful. We were all making the same, stipend. And so, learning from other people about how to make that stipend stretch, doing things collectively in the home, you know what I mean, to be able to kind of support each other during that time was also really important. And so, listening and learning from people I was living with, paying really close attention to trainings that we were receiving, and then showing up every day. And again, just like working to be consistent, because I knew how inconsistent my life, had been at the time. I knew that if my students were going through anything that I was going through, that they just want people who are really solid, to show up and to be there. And so I think the development of my leadership started there, was just learning how to do that, because nobody really teaches you that, you know what I mean? It's modeled for you. And, if you have a great mentor, if you have a parent or somebody like that in your life who can kind of break down those lessons, then that's fantastic. But I really didn't have anybody like that in my teenage years or in my college years, on every day. My grandmother got sick and was in a nursing home. And so I really turned to teachers for the like academic, kind of life coaching, but the personal stuff I never got. And so a lot of that,
watch others.
a lot of that was, figuring it out as I went.
Corey, if I can jump in there, like I think as you're sharing, man, there's so much there. And like there's a couple of things that like standing out to me and so in such a keen way, like this idea of having a purpose. And I think it really starts with like purpose, the idea of consistency. And you alluded to kids are going to call you out. Like you got to gain the trust of young people. And like one of the things that I love about it is that showing up is like the most important thing, is showing that consistency for young people. And you and I know, being in the classroom space, they don't hold their tongue. They'll let you know when you're not meeting the mark.
Absolutely.
Also, just like this idea of sacrifice, man, is really sticking with me, and understanding that as you're going through and sort of finding yourself as a man, you're still willing and able to sacrifice both your time, your commitment to pour into other young people and maybe be that role model for them that maybe you didn't have. But then also, man, it's really dope to hear you talk about just the dynamic of just growing up in the city, and the ills that try to pull us into spaces that we know just isn't right for us. So I think it's so powerful for you to say that you were able to not only say, no, that's not for me, but also the thoughtfulness and understanding, the experiences that your family went through, and like what it meant for you to take a different pathway and stand on what you knew was your purpose and your calling. And so thanks so much for like sharing that piece. I think it speaks to a lot of the things that we all as men internally deal with, and particularly those who come from neighborhoods like you and I. There's challenges that are day to day that you deal with, and some people may not understand. And thankfully, programs like the AmeriCorps can be that vehicle to help kind of understand who we are and develop that routine and consistency. So I'm gonna pivot a little bit, Paul, and I think we go way back, man. And it was very clear to me that you have a voice. You got something to say, man, and you were never bashful about that. And you did it in ways that brought people together, whether it's through music, whether through team builders, whatever it may be. And I want to pause on that, Paul, and ask, was there a particular moment in your service here where you sort of felt like you found that voice? I know I met you sort of on the staff side of things, I think during summer retreat, we sort of met. I can't put my finger like on where you were in your AmeriCorps charm, but I would love to just hear, like, how did you find your voice and be the educator and artist and leader that you are now? Is there a pivotal moment that you can sort of point at?
You know what was interesting is that in the middle of my first year, around, the Christmas winter break, we found out that our program manager wasn't going to come back, to finish out the remainder of the year. And so because of that, there were a couple of city-year kind of directors who were going to step in, support on the leadership and management side. But when they came in, our team was a little bit in disarray. There were people who were just uncertain. They had their kind of faith and belief shaken a little bit about, what to expect from, our organization and what this means in terms of partnership and relationships, for the school site. But I think I was one of the voices on my team that helped people kind of ground themselves in their larger purpose and why, right? We weren't here to serve for any individual leader or person, right? We were here to serve because these students, needed people in their lives to be that level of consistent and to be that level of support. And so because of that, I think I took a little bit more of an active role in being more vocal on my team, calling out cynicism and sarcasm, because if you let some of that fester, then people who are sharing, maybe even if it's jokes or just like negativity in jest, people start to lose sight of, like, is that actually genuine? And like, or do you really feel like that? Or, are you just playing around? And I think helping people stay connected to being their genuine, authentic selves and saying what they really mean, and not trying to disguise it with, jokes and sarcasm and all the stuff. I think that was really where I started to learn that my voice mattered on my team. I think also, there were things that we wanted to provide for our school in terms of kind of culture building. So, whether it was, and again, this is not even part of the job, but after the service, our day of service would end, I would go to the girls' basketball games, right? I would attend field trips, right? That my class, or if other classrooms needed a chaperone, right? Just thinking about the school as a holistic, cultural environment and figuring out, what do we need, right? To feel like we are coming together, right? When we didn't have a program manager, we were still kind of trying to figure things out. We found out that my principal was going to go on an extended medical leave. She was getting sick. We didn't know what was going on, but it meant that my classroom teacher was going to step up in an assistant principal role, and the assistant principal was going to, lead the school, as an interim principal. So there was a lot of that kind of change happening, right? And I think our presence helped to, keep the ship moving. The oars still got to go. Somebody still has to, provide some vision from the crow's nest at the top of the ship, right? Still gotta, cut the potatoes and make the meals, serve the crew, right? So in a service sense, it was like, what can we do every single day to help folks feel like, what, this thing is still moving, we're still going, and we can do it and still have fun and take pride in our work. There was an event that we thought could be really cool, in terms of community engagement. It was a health and safety fair. And so me and one of my teammates, we went out into the community and we recruited folks like the fire department, different health and medical centers to come to our school, to do like a demonstration day and with stations. And this was completely kind of outside of the norm, but it was a really special experience. And it was a way for us to also, add real value, to what was happening, on campus and the culture that we were developing. And so, just through that execution of that event, I realized, again, just like what you were saying, it really does take a village, right? But if we limit our village to just the people on campus, right, then we can't fully connect and serve our young people in the same way. When we think about our village as the entire community or as the city as a whole, right, it really transforms the kind of possibilities that can be created. Kids can see themselves as, scientists, as doctors, as lawyers, as, people who work for the city of Boston, even because we were able to kind of create these experiences. And so I think about that kind of thing, Anton, and I think about when I knew, and I think that's really that point where there was, you know, kind of missing leadership, right? And seeing that there was a need that needed to be filled, and stepping into that void with, and then helping others, understand that it can't just be one person that steps up, right? It's got to be us collectively doing our parts so that that leadership void that's there can really be filled.
Well, you give me a good segue into this idea or the topic of leadership. And as you were kind of sharing, a couple of things kind of along with me is what I really enjoy about AmeriCorps, and is that it's just the power of people. And as you kind of talked about, just the initiative of finding it, knowing there's a need and doing the necessary work to solve that problem, and whether a small or big way. So the people power piece there, but also just like leadership. And you talked about your first year as an AmeriCorps member, and so much change going there within the both the classroom and the school in general. But I also think as a backdrop, and I can say in some ways from both my AmeriCorps experience, but also just being in the AmeriCorps community 10 plus years, that um, in many cases, there's a lack of representation when we talk about Black being in AmeriCorps, and sometimes in the education space in general. So when you think about your experience as a Black man, as an AmeriCorps member, or just in general, your work throughout the education space, like, what has that meant to you? Have you felt that there's been a weight of responsibility to uphold and carry the work forward, just based on just the mere limited representation sometimes we see in the AmeriCorps space, and sometimes just in education space in general?
Yeah. I think that lack of representation is really a systemic problem. And so it's not just in education, right? But like the lack of, Black and brown folks in corporate spaces and nonprofit leadership and philanthropy and politics, right? Like that is an issue across the board. I think the one thing that, I've learned j- throughout my life, throughout my career, is that there is a sense of collective work and responsibility, not for self, but for, your community, for your people. And there's a, Kwanzaa principle, Ujima, that's collective work, in understanding that collective responsibility. And even if people didn't grow up with the language, I think the concept present, in many of our lives, right? But understanding that that concept is fundamentally different than what we might experience here, right? In kind of Western society, the ideas around individualism, a lot of the like hero stories, right? It makes it seem like, one person came and did all of these amazing things, and it feels like a myth. It almost feels impossible. But when you look around the world, right, like anything great that's ever been done was never done in a silo, right? Any of that stuff that, you know, has been really significant and meaningful and impactful, that was done with a whole kind of team and village of people. And so when I think about even my experience in AmeriCorps, it was a lot of the same principles and values that guided my decisions, that helped me understand, my role and responsibility here is to the greater good. It's to the collective, right? It's not just to my team, it's to my entire school site, right? It's to my entire community. What are the ways that we can step up for them, meet the needs that they express, and help everybody feel like they have what they need to just be successful. And it can feel really big, but I had brothers in service, right? I recognized, my roommate Grady was doing that at Young Achievers. We had, Guillermo as one of our team leaders who was doing that at the Agassi School right down the street, and so sure, we were, maybe the one or two on our teams, but we understood that, we needed each other, we needed our teams, right? No matter what kind of background they came from, right? We needed everybody, to find ways to come together across differences, to learn from each other's experiences, and there were times where, again, like, me being who I am wasn't always helpful. For students, I had a young girl, who was going through something, but didn't know how to express it. And she was tough. You know what I mean? Like from projects and, very, very proud, just didn't want to, so she understood that I played that role for a lot of people, but she didn't want to confide in me. She didn't want to seem, like she was weak, or like she wasn't capable of handling what she can handle,
To prove it.
Right. One of my teammates, Liz, was doing a bread making activity during one of our after school programs. And so students were just kneading dough, right? They're putting, flour, water, like all the stuff that goes into it. And they were just kneading dough. And what Liz understood was that you can release, some of that stress through your hands, through some of this kind of physical movement. And so she asked me, she said, hey, I've noticed that this student's not really responding to you. Could she spend today with me and we'll see how it goes? I was like, sure, absolutely. You can have her, let me know how this goes, and if she shares anything that you think might be helpful for me, let me know, because I'm going to see her the following day, right? And they did this bread making activity, and the student gets her hands in the dough and starts kneading, and all of the stress is released. And then all of the things that she needed to say, she shared with my teammate Liz, who is, nerdy white girl from the suburbs. You know what I mean? Like the furthest from this young girl's experience. But, in this moment, right, they completely understood each other. And for me, my role was to know when to also get out the way, and to trust, right, that my village, my team had my back, and that's not always easy, to like set the like male ego aside, and to kind of let people, step up and do this thing. But it was one of those moments that I was like, sometimes it's not the message, it's the messenger, right? And so my responsibility is to just understand that sometimes, my identity can be a plus for me in certain situations. And other times I need to realize that it is the diversity and the inclusion of others that allows us to really get to the heart and the truth of the matter, right? But I think that, again, the like African principles of Ujima, right? Of Sankofa, right? Which is, to go back and to get, cultural knowledge, right? To always constantly, be a student of, that history and that legacy, and to use that knowledge and information to then guide our decisions moving forward. I think it helped me not get stuck, right, in old ways of thinking, and to really be open to what was really possible.
I think that's a good segue into, as we start to round towards the closing of things, that we really think it's important to shine a light on those who have had a small or big impact in our life. And we have a segment of the podcast that we call Service Titan, shining a light on your service titan. And I know for me, Paul, growing up, it was really powerful and important for someone that I really looked up to say, I see you, and to kind of shine a light on something small or big that I was doing. So I want to give an opportunity for you to shine a light on the service titan in your life. Whether they've had a huge impact in your life or a small impact. I think there's been some threads of that through this conversation, but I just want to give you a space to do that a little bit more intentionally as we start to bring things to a close.
Yeah, Anton, there's so many service titans that I could talk about. It is unreal. But I think the one I want to spotlight today, his name is Charlie Rose. He's a senior vice president and dean for City Year. And before that, he was, super deep in the community, mental health, social work, coaching basketball, just, connecting with folks. He's the kind of person who remembers every single person's name after the first time he meets them. Right. And it could go years, it can go by. And then when you meet him again, he still remembers who you are, right? Facts about your life and things that help to make that connection real. After I served my first year and I knew I was coming back for a second year, and I completed a second year of AmeriCorps, I thought I was going to take my, educational award, maybe go back to school. I didn't have any plans for the summer, and, people trying to figure out what their life after City Year would look like, what leadership after City Year would look like. And, I had no idea, right? I was just trying to figure out, where do I sleep? Where can I stay? Where do I move my stuff? If I can't stay in the same place. And Charlie, saw me during one of our Friday trainings and said, hey, Paul, just want to check in on you. What are your plans for this summer? And when I told him I didn't have any, he said, come see me. Let's have a conversation. I sat in Charlie's office and, we talked about me joining the summer academy team, which puts on, this massive leadership conference for all of the City Year staff and returning AmeriCorps members. I'd be on a team that would do, the logistical portion, for putting that conference together. And then, Charlie and I, we had a great relationship, throughout my 2 years, in Boston. But from that moment on, he's really been a mentor for me and somebody who has helped to kind of guide and shape my career. It was Charlie and his team that said, hey, we think that you should apply to City Year in Sacramento. Charlie's assistant, Damon, we really had the conversation and, went down the list of things. But that relationship with Damon wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Charlie, and so me being in Sacramento, I give a ton of credit to him for that. I also think about when I wanted to apply, as my first year as a program manager in a sort of full-time, salaried staff position, it was, Charlie, who really stepped up for me and was a recommender. And I think about all of the different ways that he serves people with no expectation in anything in return, the kindness that he shares, the respect and love he gives people. It's a really beautiful thing. So shout out to Charlie Rose.
I'm gonna have to second on that because I know Charlie Rose as well, man, and it's very rare that you can meet people who are sort of built in that way, that it's unquestionable that they are about people, and want to make sure that you win, man. So thank you for shouting out Charlie. And as before we conclude our conversation, Paul, I definitely want to give you time to highlight things that are going on with you. Like, are there any social handles that you'd like to share? Any projects that are coming up? I definitely want to give you the space to sort of share with documenting the things that you're working on so they can tap you.
That's dope. Yeah, I'll keep it brief. Anybody who wants to kind of follow or stay in touch, I don't have a manager. There's no label. There's no other people you just reach out to me directly at Paul Willis is Hip Hop. I haven't had a cool rap name since 6th grade when I was hypotenuse. So, it's just Paul Willis is Hip Hop. There's many other Paul Willises in the world, but none who rap. So, there's that. And, I just published an album and book and curriculum called Hip Hop Leadership. And it's an amazing project, really about, values-driven leadership and how that exists in hip hop culture. And so if folks are interested in the music from that, or they want to read the book, or if they want to engage in the curriculum and be able to kind of teach that for their students, we have a teacher's edition for the curriculum and a student workbook that's paired along with it. And so all of that's available at hiphopleadershipbook.com. And they can learn about the project, learn a little bit more about me and what I'm working on. I'm getting ready to do a book tour in California, in early July. But I hope to bring this project really all around the country, And so, when it's time to come out to the West Coast, Anton, I'll come holler at you. And I have a friend who's actually in Detroit. He's a poet. He was the poet laureate for the city of San Francisco. But now he's doing some really amazing work in Detroit. So I'll have to hit him up and hit you up when I make my way out to the Midwest as well.
For sure, man. I'm representing Detroit Neurothome despite, being here on the West Coast, man. We definitely will put those details of how to get in touch with Paul and stay engaged with all the great things he's working on in the show notes. So as we conclude things, Paul, I want to truly thank you for taking the time to join the podcast. For sharing your insights, your experiences. Listeners, be sure to connect with Paul on the platforms he's highlighted. And with that, until next time, keep the conversation flowing, keep service front and center, and continue shining bright in your communities. This is Service Titans. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us as we explored the inspiring journeys of Black men in AmeriCorps. Keep the conversation going by connecting with us on social media. Until next time, stay committed, stay courageous, and keep striving to make a difference. This is Service Titans, where every story told is a testament to the power of service. Thank you for listening.